recognize that PMF or STAR are not all-encompassing. There's lots of aspects of school quality that we just can't fold into an accountability system for a range of reasons, but they are our best measures of school quality that we have. They convey messages to parents that impact enrollment patterns. They inform strategic and institutional decisions kind of to varying degrees across both the PMF and STAR. It impacts resource allocation. There's, I think in particular, private funding that flows to and away from schools based on the perception of quality that our accountability systems imply. And it influences behavioral incentives for educators and school leaders. You know, you probably have all heard the saying, you know, what gets measured gets attention or gets focused on. And so in that way, it's impacting how our educators and school leaders do their work around the city. And then lastly here, it has, I think, a really profound and maybe underappreciated impact on the morale of our communities of educators and families around the city. And so there's a bunch of really important implications of the design of our accountability system. And I think for all these reasons, it's really important that we get it right. So I'm actually not going to spend a ton of time talking about what I see as the problem here. I think that my understanding is you all have been engaged in this conversation for a little while, and I think already see some of the data and evidence for why why we have concerns around the demographic correlations in our the STAR ratings in particular here. But I do want to just take a moment and highlight, I think for me, the one kind of graph that best represents this issue. And so on the y-axis here, you have the STAR score, and the x-axis, we have school at-risk rate. And so as we look at this, we can see that the supermajority of schools with a low at-risk rate below 40% in the city are 4- and 5-star, and the supermajority of schools with a high at-risk rate here in the city above 60% are 1 to 3 stars. And there's very, very few outliers on either end of the graph here. And so in looking at a graph like this, I think you have to come to one of two conclusions. You can either look at this and say, our accountability system is doing a good job of measuring school quality, and it just happens to be the case that the educators in the low at-risk schools are doing a much better job of educating kids than educators in the highest at-risk schools. That's one perspective. Or the other perspective you have to come to is that it's not the case that educator efficacy is concentrated in those ways, and that the educators in our highest at-risk schools are that much worse in serving kids and families. That's not the case, but rather we're not getting something right in the design of the accountability system and the way that it's measuring school quality. It's really hard to not come to one of those two conclusions when you look at this data. I will say that there's potentially a third perspective that you could take with this, and that's that the accountability system is designed pretty well, but it's just not designed to primarily measure educator efficacy. And, you know, it's measuring things that are, we could say, are outside of the direct control or influence of educators. I don't think that that's a perspective that any leader in the city would want to take for probably some obvious reasons. If we have a accountability system that we say is not designed to largely measure educator efficacy, that's I think a system that would very quickly alienate educators across the city. And you know, pretty quickly people would lose trust in the design of the system if that was our perspective. And so either I think you have to take the perspective that the system is well designed and we have a very vast concentration of quality educators in the lowest at-risk schools, or you have to look at this data and say that we're not getting something right. And so it's, you know, difficult to test that assumption. Is this more of an issue of the design of the system? I think any good, Betsy, I'm not a professional researcher, but Betsy could tell you that good research seeks to, isolate the impact of variables. And so one of the best ways that we can isolate the impact of some variables looking at growth metrics, because that essentially says, regardless of the starting point of your students, when kids come in and at the beginning of the year, how effectively do you move them from point A to point B? And so I think this is a good way for us to say, to look at that assumption about how educator efficacy is distributed across the city. And so I ran a model that looks at all of the STAR growth metrics. So this includes MGP and growth to proficiency and the attendance growth. So if we're just looking at the growth metrics, which is something that is within the control of our educators, we can see that unlike the previous graph, when we look at growth metrics for STAR and we look at the all student group, we can see that we have both strong performing and not as low performing, low at risk schools. We look at that graph over, or the part of the graph over on the left. And if we look at the right, we'll see that we have also a distribution of quality of the efficacy of educators. We have some high performing schools and some low performing schools. And so you can see that there is some correlation. The line running through the middle there is our line of best fit. And so we can see that there's a bit of correlation there. The lowest at-risk schools have slightly better growth, but the distribution of quality that we see is not, to go back a moment, it's not what we see when we look at overall STAR scores right now. Overall STAR scores tells us there's almost no high at-risk schools that are doing a really good job of educating kids. I would put that in the 4 or 5 star category. When we're looking at growth, it's easy to look at this and say there's actually a much more equitable distribution of educator efficacy. So the next graph here has growth only metrics for an at-risk student group. I think this is an even better way to test the assumption about what's the distribution of educator efficacy, because it's an apples to apples comparison, as opposed to the all student data where we know there's some variability in the student profile across schools. Here we've got a better way to make an apples to apples comparison on a growth metric. And so in looking at this graph, you can also see again that we have some good and some bad low at risk schools in terms of their efficacy in serving kids. And if we look at the set of high at risk schools on the right, we can see again that we have some schools that are doing a really great job of ensuring our at-risk students are growing and learning, and other schools that are doing a poor job. So there's more data that we could look at, but I would say this is probably the best. These two graphs are what I believe a couple of our best ways to think about how is educator efficacy distributed. And I think they both of these graphs make pretty compelling cases for the fact that educator efficacy is pretty equitably distributed across school at-risk levels in a way that is not, that narrative is not seen when we look at overall STAR scores. So we could talk a lot more about that data, but if
you can hold on 1 second, I think Ruth has
Sure.
a question. Go ahead, Ruth.
Sure.
Yeah, so you're focused very much on this term educator efficacy, and I wonder if that is meant to mean that all you're looking at is the teacher quality, but what about things like curriculum, the organization, the climate, all the things that go into making a school high quality? Are you explicitly not trying to look at those?
Good question. So I I would say I'm thinking about educator efficacy maybe as synonymous with like another term that some of my colleagues in this work in New Orleans, they're using the language of school impact. And so, school impact might, some of the things that you just mentioned, I think could like easily kind of fall under the umbrella of the impact of a school on kids learning. And so, I'm using educator efficacy, but I think that, your point is well taken here. And I would think about the educators and leaders in the school as having control over or influence over some of the things that you mentioned, like curriculum. I also think it's worth noting here that I think that there's a lot, when I say educator efficacy, I think about my own time as a teacher, and certainly a function of my, or an aspect of the efficacy of my work as a teacher was the extent to which, I was supporting student social emotional growth, the relationships that I developed with my kids and the impact that had on them in ways that maybe sometimes showed up in test scores and sometimes did not show up in test scores. And so I do think that there's a lot that goes into educator efficacy, but I would say for the purposes of, this conversation and kind of the primary metric that makes up our state report card here, I think, educator efficacy is the extent to which, educators in schools are promoting kids' learning and growth, and how that, ultimately shows up on PARC. So let me actually pause before I move on. I'll just see if there's other kind of questions, up to this point.
I believe Emily has one.
Sorry, I was noticing that Ruth was raising her hand, so I just did that for her. I'm good.
Hey, Aaron, we've talked about this before. As always, I appreciate you elevating your work and putting students front and center of your work. Two questions come to mind, and we've talked about this before, and I'll frame this first question this way. Let's say the district made a move, or the charter board made a move to make this how they oriented around their data. What would be a trade-off or potential trade-offs that you could anticipate?
Yeah, so I actually, I'll talk a little bit about some of what I see as like the right next steps or how we can address this issue. But I'll just name here, my sharing of like this data is not advocacy for the STAR framework being a growth-only framework. I actually don't, I think that if you talked with educators across the city right now, folks have some concerns around growth metrics, and I believe, Betsy, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to raise that point. And so my advocacy here isn't necessarily that, STAR becomes growth-only metrics. I'll share what I think is the solution here. I'm just I think the growth metrics are some of our best ways to look at whether essentially to check ourselves and say, is the data that our overall score suggesting around the efficacy of schools, does that play itself out? And when we look at something that is arguably within a school's control, which is how you're moving kids from point A to point B. So I don't know if that addresses your question.
Not fully, and maybe I should just be a bit more transparent. This is really compelling to me, and I think you are spot on that there might be an opportunity for us to get tighter with evaluating school progress for what's actually happening in classrooms. Totally aligned there. My wondering is, as a city, to me, trade-off seems to be if we are not graduating students that are meeting a certain threshold of performance, whatever that threshold is, and I'm not saying that's what you're proposing, but I think that could potentially be one of the trade-offs. My question was just framed around like, then what are the consequences of that? So for instance, some of these schools, it seems like what your data is suggesting, which I find very persuasive, is that given where students are starting, given student needs and circumstances, there are teachers and schools that are doing great work and making great progress with those students. Great. I guess my question then was, if we then are not adding a emphasis on making sure all of our students are meeting a certain threshold, are we then setting up students for failure? Again, I know that's not what you're suggesting or proposing, but I think and maybe I'm leading here with the question, but I think there just needs to be another part of this, that this only addresses the data piece, but then there needs to be something else that we're addressing to make sure that our students are prepared for their future. So I'll stop there, but thanks. And then the second question, just quickly, and you could text me or we can chat offline, but there were just 3 growth metrics that you mentioned, and I didn't get the third one. It was MGP, attendance growth, and then there was a third one you mentioned.
The growth to proficiency.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think, I'll move on here and share some of what I think the right solutions are, but I'll say just like generally, my perspective is that schools ultimately, like, what we all should want to know is how effectively is the school serving kids. And right now, let's take the example Baloo. Part of what Baloo is being held accountable for right now is the work that's happening inside of that building. But a lot of what Baloo is being held accountable for is the work of all of the schools that serve kids before they walk through the doors of Baloo. And I think we have our accountability system entangles those two things. And my suggestion is that we will ultimately be best off if we can disentangle those things and hold Baloo accountable for what it does with kids when they walk in the door of the building. Because right now you could take the best educators in the city, put them into Baloo. They could make unprecedented growth with kids, growth that we haven't seen before in the city, and they still would be rated as a not very effective school, because we know the achievement gaps for kids coming into Baloo are so large. And so we're, in that hypothetical scenario, we essentially would be punishing Baloo and I think deflating like the work that happened in that building because of the failure of other parts of the system. And so I think we can't conflate like our broader failure as a community with the effectiveness of the work of educators in a school building. So in terms of I'm just watching my time here, in terms of next steps here, there's 3 things that I think are really important. In the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about the second 2. So I want to talk for a moment about design principles, and then spend most of the time on metrics. So could I actually, just so that you all aren't hearing my voice here the entire time, could I get someone to read the design principle that I'm proposing here? And actually, just before I do that, let me say, I think it would be very easy to skip over in this process as we think about STAR and how we can make it better. It'd be very easy to jump right to the conversation of metrics. I think if we do not sufficiently wrestle with this question of design principles, and if we don't make these explicit, then we're not going to ground ourselves in the right values, in the right principles. And when we have the really sticky conversations around the pros and cons of metrics, we're not going to have the right metric conversation if we don't have the right principles. And so I think right now we don't have some of the right principles in the design of our framework. And so I would just push you all to be strong advocates for making sure that part of this work going forward involves putting down principles that we commit to in the future evolution of our system. And so these are, by no means the things I'll share here don't have to be, the design principles that are taken into consideration, but there are a few of them that I think could send us in the right direction. And so,
so Aaron, before you get there, Jessica does have a question, so I want to make sure we get in those.
Sure.
Go ahead.
No, I was volunteering to read them.
Oh.
Because I share Aaron's feeling here on the need to start with principles.
Thanks, Jessica. Here,
thank you, Jessica. Thank you.
I'll put all 3 of them up, and you all can just jump in and read the principles here I'm sharing.
All right. STAR will include valid and reliable metrics that optimally reflect the efficacy of school impact on student learning, the student environment, and family satisfaction. Unless there is compelling evidence that suggests actual disparity in school quality across school demographic factors, STAR design will ensure overall scores are minimally correlated with demographic factors. STAR design will eliminate structural disincentives for service to historically underperforming student populations, instead proactively establishing incentives that will improve long-term outcomes for these student populations.
So we didn't, thank you, Jessica. So we didn't talk, a lot about this, but just to the third point here, right now we have structural disincentives in place, excuse me, disincentives in place to serve some of our most historically underperforming student populations. And over time, I think that will only harm our work in the city to close the achievement and opportunity gaps that we have. And so I think we've got to turn that on its head. And if that's not an intentional and explicit part of the design process in STAR, then I think we're missing a really important opportunity. So I want to spend the balance of my time here actually talking about metric changes, but just want to name, one more time that I think that won't matter if we don't get the right design principles in place going forward. So want to actually walk through the subgroup weightings for an example. This is a real school in Ward 8, and so this is essentially like what their report card would look like. So they're a little over on this. This school does not have an ELL, a statistically significant ELL population, and so those points would be allocated across some of the other categories here. So you can see here that the amount of points essentially they're going because of the student group weightings towards how this school's at-risk students are doing versus other at-risk students. And so I'm sure you're familiar with the design process here, but the floors and targets for this student group are set based on historical performance of at-risk students in DC. And so this essentially is an apples to apples comparison across schools. We're looking at the same student group using the same set of floors and targets normed based on that student group's population over time. And so this is essentially, we could think about this as a level playing field, whether you're achievement prep or catch-em or basis, there's a level playing field for how this part of the report card is being scored. So similarly, when we think about the student group for students with disabilities, it's about 10%. There's a level playing field there for schools across the city, regardless of their at-risk rate, regardless of the percentage of students with disabilities. The race category is a little bit of both. It's apples to oranges in that, depending on how many statistically significant subgroups or racial groups you have in your school, you might have half of that 5% be reflective of your performance with your African American students and half of it reflective of your performance with white students. But it's apples to apples in that the floors and targets for each of those subgroups are normed based on the historical performance of those populations. And so, it's a level playing field in that way. However, as we think about the last category here in our STAR weighting, the all students category, that is making apples to oranges comparisons. It's not a level playing field. And you can see here that receives the overwhelming weighting on our report card. It counts 15 times as much as, let's say, for example, the at-risk weighting. And so really, even though I think it's a good thing that we have student subgroups, and there are certain aspects of what we have here in DC that aren't true in ESSA report cards around the country. And so I think it's commendable that we have these subgroups. However, the weighting on some of our more historically underperforming student populations is so small that we ultimately still end up with the data that we looked at the beginning of the call here. And so I think that there's a way for us to address this core concern that I'm highlighting here that does not involve completely dismantling STAR. It doesn't involve doing away with overall STAR ratings. It doesn't involve actually significant structural changes to the metrics that are being used, because the student groups and their weightings are applied across all of the metrics. If we make some changes to the way, to the types of student groups and to the weightings, we can create a level playing field, and I think do a much better job of capturing where true educator efficacy is. And so, you know, I think we'll have hopefully a little more time to talk about this in the Q&A session. But what you see right here is the current student groups and weightings. So we have the all student, SPED, at-risk, race, and ELL. Just want to share two different alternatives that could go a long way towards addressing this issue. So if we supplanted the all students group, which again is that apples to oranges comparison, if we supplanted that with a not at-risk group, we would essentially create a report card that is a majority, almost entirely reflective of apples to apples comparisons. It would be a level playing field for schools across the city. The only thing, the slight caveat here is that race subgroup, depending on the statistically significant racial populations in your school, that might look a little bit different. But by and large, in this first alternative here, by getting rid of the all students group and creating a not at risk group, it creates a level playing field. And in shifting the weightings, you can see here that we are putting a lot less rating on a student population that we know historically has done pretty well, and we're giving more weighting towards historically underperforming student populations. The second alternative model that I'll share here has those same student groups, but shifts the weighting even more towards the population that we have seen with the largest correlation between that population and performance here on our report card. So we know that our most underperforming student groups on STAR are the groups with the greatest correlations are at-risk students. And so it's my belief, as I spoke to earlier, that our accountability systems drive incentives and drive behaviors. And in a model like we have in Alternative 2, a model that placed significantly more weighting on our most underperforming student populations, you would see a shift of attention and resources and focus citywide towards those particular student groups. And I think in a way that is not true right now, some of our lowest at-risk schools across the city would become more accountable to
Aaron,
the performance of their students. Yes.
I got to cut you off because I know Betsy has to leave at 3. So I know there's a lot of questions about this. So just hold, okay? We'll come back to it.
Sounds good.
And we'll go to Betsy. And it also might be that for the purposes of today's discussion, well, what you just did just starts us on the path of how we would deal with this. We might not want to get there. We might want to focus, as you said, more on what are the issues, but we can come back to that. Betsy. And thank you.
Sounds good.
Terrific.
Yeah, thanks for
Aaron.
Okay, let me okay, figure this out. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me try to get to the presenter view.
So Betsy, Betsy, before you start, for members who have raised their hand, you have to unraise your hand, or it looks like you're still raising it. So just be mindful of that when you're asking questions.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Aaron. And I did coordinate with Aaron, albeit briefly, to try to extend what he said as opposed to just repeat it. I will also say that I really had a hard time with this global pandemic going on and no childcare. So I threw these slides together. Please excuse all the typos and everything else that could possibly be wrong here. So I'm going to kind of approach it a slightly different angle, but reiterate some of the things that Aaron said. I will say I think Aaron's final slide about, reweighting is in the right direction, but I still think that even if we did that, the star ratings would still be pretty correlated, or at least, substantially correlated with student poverty for reasons I'll get into today. So I think that's, one approach, but there could be other tweaks that we can make that would even get further away from having a correlation between school ratings and poverty. So I can't advance. Why is that? Okay, so as you guys know, this is just the OSSE framework for elementary schools. 30% is proficiency right now, 40% is growth. So about 75% is some kind of test, academic achievement, whether it's achievement or growth, if you include the English language. So about 75% is achievement growth. Then what else do we care about? Well, absenteeism, attendance, and re-enrollment. So I do think that the OSSE framework about kind of what we're measuring says something about our values. So to me, this says DC's values are 75% achievement, and then attendance and re-enrollment, and that's it. So the reasons why the OSSE school ratings are correlated with student poverty is because some of the metrics are. So I want to get into a little bit about that, and Aaron did as well, about why some of the metrics are correlated with poverty and how much. So this graph is proficiency, which is the metric that's the most highly correlated with percent at risk. But I broke it down a little bit further. I broke it down into special education levels. So this first cell here is like less than 1% is special ed level 3 or 4. And this is 2 to 5% special ed 3 and 4. And this is 6 to 10%. And this is more than 10%. So as you can see that the more at-risk kids, the higher percentage of at-risk kids you have in the school, as you go this way, then the lower the proficiency rates get. And you can see that there's even slightly different lines if you're thinking about, if you disaggregate again within different levels of special education. What this tells me is that the proficiency rate is picking up family income more than it's picking up school quality. I mean, as Aaron said, it's pretty hard to believe that school quality falls on this, really pretty defined line on student at risk. So it's probably more the fact that your proficiency rate, represents what you know in 5th grade. And what you know in 5th grade is affected by all the opportunities you've ever had in your life, and your health care, and your health, and all this other stuff. So it's possible that school quality is in here. It's just so small compared to the other components that when we're using this measure, we accidentally end up picking up family income more than we end up picking up other things like educator efficacy. Now, people say, well, there's variation. There's a lot of variation, even there's a lot of variation even within schools, serving the same student population. So the black lines show me the variation between schools serving the same student population, and there is variation. That's a true statement, but most of the variation is explained by the difference in the percentage of at-risk students across schools. So it's not contradictory statements to say, oh, well, there's variation. Yes, but most of the variation is explained by student demographics. Also just want to point out that special education explains some of this too. You'll see in this cell, we have some schools here, that are really high percentage proficiency. When we get a little bit higher proficiency in level 3 and 4, it drops. When we get a little bit higher, it drops even more and then more. So just like we're thinking about at risk, I would also advocate we should also be thinking about other variables that might also be clouding our vision of what schools are doing. So the way that to think about the difference between test scores and growth, I really like kind of Sean Reardon's approach. He says that proficiency represents, all the educational opportunity you've ever had in your entire life, whereas growth represents, what's present in your schools and after school tutors and, some other things. But it's closer to the school quality measure than the proficiency. So this is the average test scores for every school in the country. So this is school level, and it's free and reduced lunch, which is a little bit a cruder of a measure than our at-risk. Our at-risk is a better measure of poverty than this, but you can see that for every school in the country, there is a correlation. Like the schools doing the best, the high poverty schools doing the best here are kind of like the wealthy schools doing the worst here. So again, the fact that this is happening nationwide probably means that average test scores are picking up more than school quality. The other argument, or the other thing that people say is like, what about schools beating the odds? What about kids beating the odds? These exist. That's absolutely true. There are kids beating the odds. There are schools beating the odds. Like this school up here is certainly beating the odds. But people aren't really interested in the outliers. For the sake of outliers, what they want to do is they want to make the outlier the mainstream. Like you want to take whatever's working in that beating the odds school, you want to implement it district-wide, and you want the whole district to rise up. I mean, that's ultimately what we want. But, schools might have exceptionalities, like it might be a magnet school. They may not accept special ed students. Like there might be all these different things going on that when we think about the system level, you even see the discrepancy. It's just so much more pronounced. So, I mean, there's not a single school district in the United States that comes anywhere close to, serving the majority poor students here, that comes anywhere close to school districts serving fluent students. A lot of that has to do with, the way schools are funded on local property taxes and whatnot. But I mean, I think the reason researchers are so comfortable controlling for growth is because there are literally no examples of it working system-wide if you don't do it that way. So as Aaron said, our growth measures are better in the sense that they're not as correlated with student poverty. However, DCs actually still kind of are a little correlated. You see in this cell that it doesn't look like there's any correlation here, like doesn't look like there's any kind of downward lines, but when you look within each special education band, you see like there's a pretty clear downward line here, and there's a pretty clear downward line here. So that tells me that maybe we need to tweak the MGP because it looks like it's still not assessing growth as fair as it could be. Just to give you an example of Sean Reardon's work, they use a different growth model. I won't say it's more complicated because the growth model to actually run MGP is quite complicated. But they use a different growth model, and you see that across schools nationwide, you don't really see maybe you see an ever so slight trend, but you don't really see a correlation between growth and free and reduced lunch. So maybe we could do a little bit better here in terms of making sure our growth metrics aren't actually picking up student demographics. So MGP, right growth metric, I'm not sure. Probably could be better. The other caution I will say is, I do side visits and I go into schools across the country, and I went to one school and where they were beating the odds, and this wasn't in DC, so I don't want anyone to jump to assumptions, but the school was beating the odds, and one of my questions to them was, why are you beating the odds? Like, I asked the teachers, principal, like, what do you think it is that your school did that made you beat the odds? And they just had a new test, like it was just a brand new test that they had rolled out, and they said to me, well, one of the things we did is we looked at the test items, and the test items were different than the ones before, so we changed everything we did in our class to be like the test items. So the kids, are so used to the test items. It's not like a strange test item. And I thought to myself, wow, that's really smart. Like that, if I were a teacher, I'd probably do the same thing. But at the same point, I kind of walked away from that thinking like, could I really say that kids learned more content? Or was that just like teaching to the test? So I'm worried. I think growth should stay, like no question. I don't want to be confusing about that, but I do want to be clear about that. I'm worried about if we make something 80% growth or 90% growth or 70% growth, that it opens the door for gaming the system, which we want to make sure that what we're measuring actually is measuring what we care about, and that's that kids are actually learning more. There's a bunch of other technical things that I won't go into, but it's hard. You know, if our growth measures are really imprecise, meaning like if we're not super confident about them, you know, to what extent should we be using them in school accountability, or how can there are ways or things you can do to make sure that whatever measure you're using, you have some level of certainty about it. And I'm not sure that we're doing that. So just being careful with the measures to making sure that we're using best practices that are available, you know, in the field right now. So I really liked this chart by the Josh Boots did. And it kind of shows, I know it's hard to read, but it kind of shows all the different STAR metrics and how much they're related to various things. And you see that, you know, here proficiency is really correlated with at-risk, and so is the MGP, which in my opinion really shouldn't be happening. Then you also see like re-enrollment and attendance is really correlated with at-risk. And there's been some researchers that have said, hey, like, you know, be careful that when you're measuring attendance, you're also not doing the exact same thing we've been talking about, and that you don't want to be picking up family income as opposed to school quality. So let's look at re-enrollment, for example. So if we look at re-enrollment by percent at risk, again, we see a downward trend that's pretty defined here in all our special education brackets. Why is that? Well, in the DC Auditor's Report found that, you know, at-risk kids were more likely to change schools between years. Kids living in wards 7 and 8 were more likely to change schools between years. And when people were changing schools, 1/3 of the time that coincided with moving home. So if we have a high poverty school, which we know has more student mobility, but if it has more student mobility because students are literally housing insecure and moving around, like, is that the fault of the school? And if we just measure re-enrollment, we're going to get a correlation with at-risk that's has nothing to do with the fault of the school, and it's going to penalize high poverty schools. We can absolutely keep re-enrollment in STAR. So I think I'm saying the same thing as Aaron, where we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We just have to be a little bit more careful. We can absolutely include enrollment in STAR, but maybe what you do is for anyone who changes residences, you take them out. And I admit I haven't read the technical appendix in a while, so I'm not exactly sure how OSSE calculates it. But there are things that we could do where we could say, okay, well, how much, you know, what exactly is in control of the school and what is not in control of the school, and see if we could somehow parse that out. I mean, the data exists, so it can be done. Obviously, you know, with anything, there's a burden associated with it in time, but I think we just have to be more careful about our metrics. So what are the implications? Well, obviously, as Aaron said, you know, we don't want to be systematically just giving more affluent schools that are in DC are usually more white, you know, high ratings, and giving all our low-income schools or schools serving Black populations lower ratings. That there's something wrong with that. You know, but I will say this is not STAR's fault. The idea that school quality is defined by test scores is ingrained. Like, you hear it everywhere, no matter where you go. You hear it on the playground, you hear it in the grocery store, you hear it at church, you hear it wherever you go. That well, I can't send my kid to that school. Why? Because the test scores are bad. It is so ingrained. And I think a lot of times people have made additional jumps ahead. These are assumptions they're already holding on to that they may not even know they're holding on to, that white schools are good schools, Black schools are bad schools. Like, that's ingrained. So it's not STAR's fault. But what I will say is my hope would be that STAR would be an opportunity to try to disrupt assumptions. It would be a tool, perhaps, that would maybe make people question what they already believe. Like, for example, if you had a school with, you know, that got a 5 stars, maybe that would cause someone to say, hey, that school got a 5 stars. Like, what's going on there? Interesting. Like, what are they doing right? Maybe not. You know, I can't say for certain what would happen, but that would be my hope. Finally, I'll say that, you know, I do think, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, I do think what we're measuring says a lot about our values. And so right now in DC, we're very, you know, test focused, and we're only test focused in reading and math and science, which just came up recently. You know, I think most people would agree that we care about more than that. And so just to give you an idea, this is what the core districts in California, this is what they put on their, these are the metrics in their school accountability system, and they've done a lot of work to think through how to measure school quality in a fair and equitable way. So you see a lot of it's exactly the same as ours. They have growth, except that, you know, they have a slightly different analysis. It's not so correlated with poverty. They also have, you know, test scores, academic performance is right there. They also have English learner progress. They also have absenteeism. They also have social emotional surveys, and they have school culture and climate surveys, and they also have disproportionality in special education. That's interesting because that could go, you know, one of two ways. It could be that, you know, Black kids are either over or underrepresented in SPED. But the point is they care about this. Because they care about it, they're going to measure it in some way. You know, I also get their constraints. Like, I think a lot of what is measured here is just what was available across, you know, however many LEAs we have. But, you know, that doesn't mean that that has to be the way moving forward. Some other ideas about possibilities of things we can measure is safety. For me as a parent, like, my number one concern is safety. And maybe that is kind of captured here in the school culture climate surveys. But, you know, are students safe? You know, do they feel safe? And then anything else that we care about, like if we care about school diversity, you know, we can make it a metric. Whatever DC cares about, whatever we decide, you know, are our values, we could try to use the data we already have to incorporate that into the our accountability system. Okay, I will stop there.
So I noticed that we have a question from Jessica in the chat. Betsy, can you see that?
Yes.
Before you answer, wait, can I just say one thing? I think Betsy has to go very soon. Am I right, Betsy?
I'm okay. As long as the baby doesn't scream, we're
okay.
good.
All right,
we'll
fine.
be right safe.
Otherwise, I was going to try to organize the questions in a different way. All right.
All right. So, yeah, okay, sorry.
Betsy, I can read it since
Okay.
we're talking now. So I'm just trying to make sense of all sorts of data that I'm hearing. Thank you for your thoughtful presentation and for the use of the California Core District stuff. I appreciate that a lot. Erin Roth and I had a conversation about the My School DC lottery, and she noted that only 1/3 of families every year are entering it. Not for the first time, right? Like, most families will enter it at some point, but most families are not using it every year. So how should we take that information into account when we're thinking about the way that re-enrollment might unfairly be biased sort of towards students that are more mobile? Is it because most of the students who are showing up as failing to re-enroll are actually moving home? Are the two totally unrelated? Is there some other way we should be thinking about those two facts?
I'm not sure if I can answer. I don't know if I have all the information to answer your question. You know, I will say there is a trend to move back to your neighborhood schools, but that trend only exists for at-risk students or for the highest poverty schools, right? So it is possible that, and I don't even know, like, if you re-enroll in that, like, I don't even know what the cut points OSSE uses are to calculate re-enrollment.
Got it. Got it. Okay, so it sounds like there's more questions we'd have to ask, but that there are some trends worth noting in there. Thank you.
I just wanted to actually build on a point that Betsy made about this not being an issue specific to DC. And I'll say that, you know, I've spent a lot of time over the past months trying to find an awesome equity-focused framework that really addresses this issue. And I have found aspects of certain school accountability systems around the country that are strong, but by and large, I think largely because of, on the federal level, largely because of the design of how people think about having to implement ESSA. This core issue here is present in accountability systems across the country. And I am very confident that it is only a matter of time that change is coming on this issue nationally, because what's happening across the country is what's happening here in DC, which is the educators in high poverty schools are stepping back and feeling alienated by the accountability system and saying, hey, this isn't accurately capturing the efficacy of our work. That's happening in DC, and it's happening across the country. And I think the opportunity for us in DC is to get out ahead of this change and to be a model that other folks around the country can follow, to be a model of, like, talking transparently about this issue and thinking creatively about how to solve it. And I've gotten feedback from folks in other places around the country that people think we are on the leading edge of this work in DC in a way that's coming elsewhere, but you know, I think we're just maybe a little further along in the conversation. And so just wanted to like echo Betsy's comment about this, like not necessarily being specific to the STAR framework, but being pretty common in the data and in accountability frameworks across the country. And I think there's an opportunity for us to really courageously lead nationally on this issue.
Oh, I see Emily's hand.
Hi. I guess listening to both of you, I have a question first for Aaron, or like a clarification question. So I'll put that out, and then I have a sort of bigger, so maybe, I don't know if it's the principles question. But I wanted you, Aaron, to explain a little bit more about this, what was it? Disincentive, I wrote it down somewhere. Oh, structural disincentives. I don't actually know what that is. So if you could explain that. And then my other question for both of you is just about the STAR rating in general. I mean, Betsy, you brought up this question of how do you not encourage sort of gaming the system, right? And I think when you brought up this other metric of like, you know, disproportionality of students of color in special ed, I immediately thought, well, if that was one of our metrics, then schools would start gaming that and you wouldn't put kids who actually need to be in special ed. That's what I would be worried about. Because I think ultimately, you know, it's kind of what you said about we really should be taking a stance of curiosity when we see whether it's a 5-star or 1-star school, like what does this actually mean? But I feel like the stars themselves dissuade us from doing that. So, and I'm speaking for myself, not for the state board, right? But I guess I'm just curious what you think about the possibility of, you know, not encouraging schools to game the system or to sort of teach to the test if that is, you know, what is being valued most. So those are.
Sure, I can talk to the first question you asked around disincentive. So, you know, if we just go back and think about that graph with overall STAR scores, because of what we know to be true, unfortunately, of the achievement rates of various populations in our city, you know, we know that there's a significant achievement gap for at-risk students in the city. And we have, this is true both of the PMF and of the STAR framework, but, you know, we have frameworks because of the amount of points given both to traditional achievement metrics and to essentially the all students weighting. Because of those two things, a school with a higher proportion of at-risk students is going to be more likely to score lowly, and so schools are disincentivized. If it, you know, every school leader out there probably aspires to run, you know, a 4 or 5-star school. And, you know, that, I think it impacts behavior in subtle ways. I certainly think about, like, you know, the charter sector where as we charter new schools, you know, I think about like Statesman Academy in, you know, in Ward 8 in the PR Harris building. They've chosen to serve a, you know, their mission specific focus is serving a student population that is among our most historically underperforming in African-American young men. And like they will pay the price for that in our accountability system. And
Gotcha.
I think that what we need to do is turn that on its head, and we need to create incentives to serve the students who I think we all are like, most invested in turning around outcomes for.
Right. So that makes sense. And your metric.
The same is true for SPED.
Yeah.
People are disincentivized from serving because of what we know to be true about the historical performance of special education students. Schools are disincentivized from serving more special education students. In changing the subgroup weightings, that would largely eliminate, essentially getting rid of the all students group, that would eliminate that disincentive.
That makes a lot of sense. And can I just say that I really like the idea of removing the all student category, because it made me realize that that is sort of the implicit message there, is that that's the norm, right? Is that you come from middle class or a household with means, and that's what it ends up meaning, right? To some extent. And then you're sort of disaggregating that as an actual category, I feel like.
This is Betsy. So I will speak to your point about gaming the system. I think on some level there's only so much you can do, but I think one of the things that Jack Schneider, who does a lot of work in this area, has suggested is having lots of metrics, because the idea is you have, lots of metrics. It's more than, it's not just 80% on one thing. It's pretty hard to game all of them at the same time, right? So that would be, just having like kind of a wider range of things where it's harder to game the system. And also data checks. I think data checks are critically important. I'm not sure how much we're doing that right now, but for example, if you gave a survey out and you did a data check where every person from that school said a 5, I would flag that as something's going on there, right? That's probably not fully accurate data. So there are some data checks you could do as well. The other thing I want to say too, and I didn't bring this up in my report or my presentation, is the at-risk group is a little tricky in high school, because you're combining the SNAP, TANF, and high school students that are 1+ years older. And I think a lot of times, like a 1+ year older high school student, might overlap with SNAP and TANF, so it's fine. But more recently, I've seen some kind of crazy things, and I'm thinking that's because you might actually have affluent kids in that at-risk high school group. I think my son might actually technically be at risk when he's in high school. So that might be a reason that when we're kind of tweaking it, that the at-risk group, maybe you take out the, you take out kids who don't qualify for TANF or SNAP or something like that.
This is Ruth. I have my hand up. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So one question for each of you. So I'm a little confused and not following the different ways of doing the rating. So let me start with Betsy. You said something about there's ways to make the growth indicator better, which I didn't quite get. And then Aaron, you had the making it all go into the different groups, which I also didn't quite get. So let me start with Betsy, because she may have to go at any moment, and then I'll come back to Aaron. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a ton of different growth metrics you can use, and I think on that reading list I sent around, there was like a prime on growth metrics, and it had a bunch of them, but basically just use one that...
That was a great list, Betsy. Thank you.
Just use one that doesn't produce results that are correlated with poverty, that have, for example, one thing that could be going on with our MGP is that it's not adequately accounting for differences in special education. So maybe that's why you're seeing that link. I'm not really sure, but there are better growth metrics that we could use where we'd still be doing growth. But we're not sacrificing growth, but we're getting like a better quality measure out of it.
Well, let me ask a question. I think it also speaks Aaron's, but it seems to me the goal is to have a quote good quality measure, that we want a good indication of what is a well-functioning school doing its job, not just a rating system that is equity focused, insofar as equity focused means everybody, regardless of where they are on the spectrum, ends up doing equally good, because there's a lot of reason to think that's not the case. And part of the reason for doing this is to highlight that and make it transparent. So Betsy, when you say there are growth metrics that have less correlation with poverty and SES, how do we know that that makes it better and not worse or different?
Well, I would say two things. One is, you can look, you could run it and look and see, oh, there's variation among the schools for sure. And triangulate it with other data sources. But then also we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's already growth metrics that have been validated by very smart people.
I see.
So we could use that, and then, we can look and see what the results are for DC.
And so you're saying there are better, we know for a fact there are better growth metrics that do a better job of capturing actual growth, and we're not using them for some.
Correct.
Okay.
Ruth, I would just say too, like your bigger point, I completely agree with you that the end goal is not necessarily flattening the line of correlation here. The end goal is an optimal measure of school quality. And for a whole bunch of reasons, like if we can get an optimal measure of school quality, and we close the schools that we know for a fact are poor schools, not because of the student population, but because of the efficacy of their work. And we can learn from and celebrate and even grow the schools that are doing the best job. Like that, ultimately, at the end of the day, is going to be best for our kids. And so the goal is to optimize the extent to which the system measures school quality. And that might actually leave us with some correlation that we see. I think even if you think about some of those slides that I showed earlier, it wasn't that there was no correlation between, the at-risk growth and the school poverty level. There was still some correlation, but just not to the degree, the dramatic degree that shows up in overall star ratings. And so, I think that your point is well taken here. The goal is figuring out how to get the best measure of school quality, but it should be a flag to us when the data looks as it currently does. And to Betsy's point, one way it's kind of tough and maybe impossible to perfectly suss out how much of that is demographics and how much of it is a function of actual errors in the measurement tool. But if we look at a bunch of different data, like the growth data, it gives us some sense of the degree to which the issue is one of the measurement tool versus something else.
All right. So let me just say it's 3:15. Clearly, we didn't schedule enough time for this. I'm game to revisit it if others want to and our speakers are able to. Let me say this, for the other business, we really just need maybe 7 minutes at the end just to sort of establish a couple of things going forward. So with that, I have a follow-up, but I want to first throw it open to other people. So I'm looking at the hands bar. Anybody want a hand up? Okay, then I'm going to follow mine up, which is to go back to the apples to apples diagrams you had. Here's what I don't understand. How does that respond? I mean, I thought you set up the dilemma very well, which is to say, here you have blue as an example, and they're being rated in effect on everything that child has learned, their experience in schools and life, all the way to the moment they're in Banneker, in blue, combined with what actually happened at blue. So it seems to me that's sort of what you want. It seems to me you were sort of saying you want to figure out how to not conflate those two, distinguish those two, and I'm not clear how the apples to apples comparison does that.
Yeah, can I actually, is it possible to have I'd love to just pull up the slide to talk through it. And the facilitator here, give me opportunity to
Yeah,
go back
hold on
to
one
that
second.
slide. Sure.
And I keep going off to drink my drink because it feels really rude to drink on air.
All right. Are you all able to see this again?
I am.
Oh, there we go. So, you know, the way these subgroups work is it gets applied to all of the, you know, the metrics on the report card. And so I think like our easiest way to address this issue, you know, there are certain metrics that need some changes, but the easiest way to address this issue is through the student groupings. And I think the most likely way that we get changes, you know, ultimately approved with the education department. I think to your question, Ruth, about like my example of Baloo, creating a report card that is a more level playing field, you know, eliminating the all students group and putting in a not at risk group and shifting the weighting around would not perfectly address kind of the predicament that, you know, Baloo is in within our accountability system. You know, the one way that someone might argue for, like I know a prominent school leader in New Orleans who says, let's just make the entire report card growth. And I think for the reasons that Betsy spoke to, that can create some challenges. You know, if it was a growth only report card, that might put Baloo more in control of the factors that are driving the, you know, the scores on the STAR framework. However, having a, you know, a one metric report card brings a whole bunch of other problems, and, you know, the diversity of types of metrics that we have that you know, I hear Betsy saying it's, you know, not diverse enough, but I think, you know, in the range of metrics that we have on the report card right now, it does mitigate the downside of, you know, the problems of any particular metric. And so my argument would be, you know, I think we put a school like Baloo in its best position to have a report card if it's being, if its performance with at-risk students actually has some substantive weighting, and if the floors and targets for, you know, that particular subgroup for that population are normed based on historical performance. Because right now, essentially what we have is, you know, we have the student population to, you know, student population of Beale, a more like privileged student population, just advantages Deal so much more than, you know, Baloo's performance with at-risk students right now counts 5% of its report card.
Can I just, I know we're trying to wrap up, but I feel like I'm stating the obvious, but I think I'm also echoing, I don't want to say echoing, but I'm, I think Zachary raised this earlier about proficiency being kind of the point of accountability and why we have all of this in the first place, and you're challenging that, right? You're challenging, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, that our measure of accountability for schools should be that we are closing the achievement gap according to test scores between at-risk and students who are not at risk. That is what I understand to be the point of our accountability system. I'm not saying I agree with it because for the reasons you're bringing up, but I guess when we talk to, you know, OSSE about this, I think their understanding is that that's the point. I think it's for a lot of folks the point of it, right? So I guess I'm just curious your response to that.
Yeah, I think my argument is would not be to take away the proficiency metrics. I think it's to take what, you know, essentially what has been started with STAR the inclusion of an at-risk student group or the inclusion of a students with disability student group is the right first step. And I think we still, the reason that doesn't get us far enough in terms of having a strong measure of school quality is because of the all students weighting and the fact that it counts 15 times the weight of, the at-risk group, for example. So let's keep proficiency in here, but let's have a more, the not at-risk group, I think, is just a more precise and specific student grouping. And let's give more weight to the student populations that, I think, I know OSSE has as a priority right now, improving SPED student outcomes across the city. And I will say, what probably the quickest way they could do that is by doubling the weight on the STAR report card for that student group. I think you would see people attending to, school leaders across the city would attend to that student group in a different way. And so
That makes sense.
It's not getting rid of proficiency, but rather, I think just shifting how we're thinking about the report card kind of capturing proficiency across student populations in the city.
Right, and how you're rewarding schools, what you're rewarding them for. That makes sense. On a timeline, and there's another meeting starting at 3:30 with many of the same people. I have a lot of questions about that last back and forth, so at least for me, I'm not done with it. Does anybody have 1 minute that they want to get in one last thing? All right, guys, Aaron and Betsy, thank you so much for doing this. It was a great sort of immersion for an hour into what we're looking at and the beginning of a discussion about what kind of modifications might make sense. Although I want to go back to where you started, which is probably for us coming to some agreement on the principles probably is a good next step. So I'm going to think about that for our next meeting. So let me do this. So Aaron and Betsy, do you mind if I just shut down? Are you expecting it's okay? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's very awkward to not be able to be here and thank you personally and even give you a hug or whatever, but it was great. And more to come. I hope we'll be able to do this again. And you're welcome to stay on if you want. People, there's 3 quick things we need to do. One is to just agree that we're going to have regular meetings. I think based on the comments that I've heard, it would be the second Wednesday of every month at 2 o'clock. Does that go with everybody? Any big problems? Okay, I'm counting that as a go. All right, the second is we would like to get started on possibly commissioning someone to write something, and we had agreed on, well, let me say, I had put out multiple times that I thought we should go forward with Andrew Ho. He was on a couple of the different lists. He dealt with a lot of these issues. Nobody's objected. I would like to just make sure that everybody thinks that's a good first step. And we will, in the next meeting, one of the things we'll do is sort of revisit how we're going to do this, maybe look at a longer list, look at the locals, possibly think of a different way to go about this. Does that work for everybody?
That works for me.
All right. Anybody else want to weigh in or not weigh in? Okay. So I'm going to count this as
in the chat. Andrew Ho works for me.
Okay, great. Because what we could have should have done this more formally, and it's partly trying to deal with the changing process in terms of OCP, and partly being behind. But ideally, this should be. I want this to be a consensus, sort of part of my thought on how we can do this in a non-competitively, so to speak, is that
we have an ideologically diverse committee, and if we agree, we know that we're going forward with something that makes sense. So I want to record this as a consensus insofar as it is. So everybody who's on here, you're being recorded as part of that consensus.
Marcus or Zachary, do you want to verbally consent?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Zach, are you there?
Zach said he had to jump off at 2:45.
Oh, that's. I think actually Zach said something to me earlier, but Alex, if you could just double check that with him, that would be great, and then we would know it. Same with Jack, I think. All right. Last thing is to sort of get this moving. We had talked at our last meeting about using the May public meeting as a time to sort of pull some of these people back in, different people, same people, get a little clearer on what we want them to say and what we want to present publicly. And we're just, needless to say, with everything Corona, how we're dealing with these public meetings, or how we're scheduling them is a bit in the air. But what I'd like to confirm with everybody here is that, yes, we would like to do that in May. And then part of our next meeting can be to sort of nail that, not nail that down, but fill that out. So again, is that good with everybody?
Ruth, this is Jessica. I have just one question.
Yes.
I think it makes a lot of sense from our timeline of the research committee. I wonder what other decisions may be before the board in May, given the current situation and policy changes that may need to take effect. And I just want to make sure that we don't either shortchange guests that we invite or end up with a meeting that goes until 9:30 or 10.
Very fair point, very good point. And I guess the thing to say is, who knows? But let's all use a little bit of flexibility, I guess, is the thing to say. And that's about all I can say.
Yeah, I think I would just err on the side of making sure that we invite one panel, if we can, instead of two, giving consideration to the potential duration of that meeting.
Fair enough. And let's...
I imagine, for instance, that the public may also have a lot to say about anything that may be occurring.
Right, right. All right. Well, let's, point well taken. That will be the plan. And
Can I just actually ask something?
The plan, I just want to say the plan going forward, understanding that we're going to be flexible, because what may turn out to be a second panel would be about this, right? About Corona and what we're doing. So let's, but I agree. All right. Emily?
Never mind, actually. That's, yeah, never mind.
All right.
I'm good.
Okay, so we have a little bit of a plan. One thing for the next meeting, which I think with our new meeting date will just be about 10 days from now, which is good, is either on my own or via some conversation with people, we'll try to kind of narrow down, sort of digest some of the stuff that we did today and last time into some documents, whether it's an update on the timeline or proposals for the big meeting or whatever. So that's what you can expect from me. And now we have another meeting at 3:30. Do we need to hang up and start again, Alex, or can we just stay put?
Yes, we're going to hang up and start anew with a new calendar invite.
Okay, great. Well, guys, that was my first time doing this. I learned a lot from Jessica last week, watching and trying to participate in social studies. So I think we're all.
You were great. It was a wonderful meeting.
It was a very good meeting. Can I just suggest that we take a 5-minute break?
Yeah, and is there anybody, so we're missing Zach. I don't know if Zach is coming, I guess he's coming back, right?
He should be, yeah.
All right.
He said he was.
Yeah, so we'll start at 3:35?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.